if you want to flourish as a human, well, I've got 15 things I learned working homicides. Now, they happen to be supported by the studies, the secular studies, so I've included all of those. But they also are ancient principles that are on the pages of the New Testament.
Back when he was an avowed atheist, J. Warner Wallace put his skills as a cold case homicide detective to work investigating the claims of the Gospels, and he became a follower of Jesus. Now, he is a speaker, apologist, and an author, as well as a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, an adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University, and a faculty member at Summit Ministries. I've spoken with him on previous episodes about his books Cold Case Christianity and Person of Interest, and he's back on to talk about his latest book, The Truth in True Crime: What Investigating Death Teaches Us About Life. We'll discuss our culture's fascination with true crime and murder mysteries, and the important life lessons that Wallace learned over his career investigating real-life cases, and what these lessons teach us about ourselves and our Creator. In our conversation, we'll talk about the importance of humility, how the gospel impacts every area of life, and the cautionary lessons we learn from the bad guys that he's helped put away. The Truth in True Crime takes lessons learned from crime scene investigations and, more importantly, found in the pages of Scripture, and distills them into 15 principles that everyone should know and pursue. So let's jump into this conversation with J. Warner Wallace. All right, well, thanks for joining me once again on the Reasonable Theology Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, I think this makes number 4, so you're still reigning champion on return guest for the podcast.
Well,
So
that is
you're
always the
defending your
goal.
title
Yes,
well.
that is always the goal,
That's
is
right.
to make sure that
It's what it's
nobody
all been
gets ahead of
about.
me. That's always exactly right. So
Yeah.
at least I let me know if I need to get back on again to beat somebody else out of this
That's right.
competition.
I'll give you a heads up if someone's sneaking for your title.
Good.
So the newest book is Truth in True Crime: What Investigating Death Teaches Us About the Meaning of Life. So obviously, you've been a homicide detective for many, many years.
Mhm.
What do you make of our culture's fascination with true crime shows and murder mysteries and books and podcasts? Even when I was young, Law and
Mm.
Order's been popular for like 100 years, but
Yeah,
it
no
seems more
kidding.
popular than
Yeah.
ever. What do you
Yeah,
make of that?
and the spinoffs and everything else. Yeah, you know what? I try not to be too philosophical about it because I think usually the answer is the simple answer, and I think it's usually what is it about our base nature that makes us interested in this, rather than are we thoughtfully thinking about how to talk? No, probably it's that we love being able to solve mysteries. People still like trying to figure out who the bad guy is, and that's why the best kept secret about Dateline episodes, and I've been in a bunch of them, is that when we get with the producer, the case is typically resolved. Often we've already been to trial or we're about to go to trial. So we already know who the bad guy is. But of course, when they tell the story, they want to script it out in a way that they don't reveal who that guy or gal is until the last segment. Or if we're going to do a 2-hour episode, it's going to be like maybe the 3 episodes from the end, 3 segments from the end, so they can get there, to the trial. So they're unwrapping it in a way that plays to that experience we all want to have of being the first to solve it in the room, or watching with our friends or whatever. So that's part of it, I think. But I also was reading, interestingly, a woman who wrote an article on this, because it turns out that the weirdest thing about true crime fans is that they're dominantly female. So the audience for true crime shows, and the producers know this, and then the question becomes, well, why? Why is that the case? And that's, I think, a more interesting question, because it may be, and she actually posited this, that she thought it was because women are often the victims of these kinds of crimes that are perpetrated by men, and that has been true. I've seen that also. Even when a wife decides to kill her husband, she's probably hiring somebody to do it, so it's a male suspect, although she's behind
Yeah.
it. So that's also interesting, though, right? When you see that, and so what she was saying, this columnist was saying that she thought it was a matter of women who are watching the show kind of as a cautionary tale to see if there's anything like that in their lives that they might be able to prevent. And I thought that was interesting because that's kind of what this book is really about. It's 15 crime stories and 15 cautionary tales, like 15 ways that humans have messed up, and how we could actually flip that script and flourish if we just didn't do that. So there's 15 rules for life because I'm going to show you 15 ways that people messed up. And they're very common. I mean, these are the same things you see over and over and over again if you do any kind of crimes persons. If you're assigned to detectives, you're going to be assigned either crimes property or crimes persons. So crimes property would be like, burglaries, auto theft, and crimes involving property, and crimes persons will be all the assaults, sex crimes, domestic violence, and murders. So if you're working in that crimes persons category, you're going to see a lot of different ways that people either have done a good job of avoiding being a victim or have unfortunately become the victim. And you get a lot of information about the dark side of our human nature. I think that that's of interest to people because let's face it, we're all looking to see if is there something in this episode that is a domino that I should be looking for? That did I push over a similar domino? I mean, I'm seeing this behavior over here. Like, they are basically cautionary tales.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly a different experience in real life on your side of things than
Mhm.
someone, sitting on the couch watching the latest, Netflix drama or whatever it might be. So uh, definitely, there's an odd, maybe somewhat unhealthy element that so much of it is entertainment at this point. But the reason for it, as you say, is it's understandable.
Yeah, well, in truth is stranger than fiction, right? So that's the thing I think people see is that, yes, you can watch, movies that are scripted, that are fiction novels or whatever brought to life, but what's interesting about these cases, as bizarre and twisted as they can sometimes be, they are all just really the way we behave, especially when we're at that critical moment when we're about to do something. Because here's what you learn, is it's not like there's, like, these categories of people. There's criminals and there's victims. Well, of course, there are when you get to actual investigating the crime, but in largely, my cases are cases in which what you might consider to be an ordinary guy or gal 30 years ago did this horrific thing. And he didn't make it a habit. He didn't do it again. He just did it one time. Well, that makes you start to stop and pause and think, "Well, why?" I mean, this guy right now looks like his record looks better than ours. So the question is, how does somebody like this get to that place? And then you realize as you're unwrapping that, boy, that could be anybody. I mean, his marriage didn't sound that much different than my marriage, or his job didn't sound that much different than whatever stresses he was facing weren't that much different than what I was facing. And it is humbling, I think. So that a lot of the takeaways you get to working these cases is just a kind of a proper assessment of who we are as humans.
Yeah. And I mean, as you mentioned, your experiences, you're often coming way after the fact, right? You're
Yeah.
coming into
Mhm.
this and investigating a crime. As you mentioned, maybe it was 30 years ago, and everybody else might know him as a great neighbor.
Yeah. No,
The
no
nice
doubt.
mailman. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. Now, what I did in this book, just to kind of capitalize on a lot of different cases, is I included cases when I was working gangs. Those were fresh cases. I included cases that were fresh murders that just occurred that I got assigned because I was working robbery homicide, and I've included cases that were part of my cold case career when we actually finally did get a team. In our agency, because it's a smaller agency, well, actually, even on big agencies, you're going to get the chance to work a cold case if you want to. Because I don't you could be working auto theft. I bet you if you were willing to open a cold, crimes persons case and the sergeant was like, "You wanna work it? Great, but don't re you can't work it instead of your regularly assigned cases, but if you got time, knock yourself out." That was kind of always the view of our agency. So I started really early with a case that my dad had opened that was assigned to him back in 1972, and I remember it as a kid. That was the first cold case I ever cracked a notebook on, and it didn't get solved for another 25 years or so. So that's how long that case was open. It didn't solve, I think, till 4 years after I finally retired. So that's just the nature of these cases. You keep your fingers in them, they keep calling you back to ask questions. You consult on these cases until they finally close, or it's getting so old that you can't work them. And that's what gives you this long view of human nature, right? Because you come in contact with somebody and you get to chart out what he was like in 1972, and now what's he like in when you're interviewing him in 1985? What was he like in 1996? What was he like in 2010? And that kind of gives you another perspective on the nature of who we are and how we end up doing these kinds of crazy crimes.
Wow. Well, we've had a chance to talk about some of your previous books. We talked about Person of Interest. We
Mhm.
talked about Cold Case Christianity. And a lot of that was obviously your unique experience and kind of approach to those things from your own story, but more or less kind of your standard apologetics book in terms of what people can expect. There's a lot of evaluate the evidence, argumentation, that sort of thing.
Right, right.
Truth and True Crime is a different kind of book. Could you just share a little bit about like format? What is the premise of this book? How do you approach it differently?
Well, I think what makes it different is the kind of rules for life side of it, which is really the stuff that I talk to mostly. If like you would call me probably to Clay just to say, "Would you be on this podcast?" And we all talk about this stuff on the podcast. But if you called me personally, I suspect you wouldn't be calling me asking me a theological question or an apologetics question. Probably because you could call anybody who's a good theologian or a good apologist to ask those kinds of questions. But if you had something weird in your life where you're not quite sure what to make of somebody, that's probably when you're going to call me. And those are all my phone calls. So this is a book that's really practical wisdom on how, if the Christian worldview is true, how does it impact the different aspects of our daily life? And so it's full of lots of suggestions about how to flourish. That's why it's trending in these weird categories right now on Amazon. It's trending in apologetics, but it's also trending. It was number one new release in self help. I thought that was interesting. Although you and I would say, well, this kinds of books aren't really about me helping myself. It's about how I'm employing the truth of God's, you know, special revelation to actually surrender my life to Christ. But it ends up in the self help category for a lot of people. It also was trending number one for a while in serial killers' true accounts. And I thought, okay, weird categories to be trending at the same time. But that's what this book really is. It's an interesting hybrid because it encapsulates all the stuff that typically I talk about when people call me because they're not usually calling me. But it's even more interesting than that, I think, because I think what happens when we have an opportunity to have a conversation with someone about Christianity, it's probably not going to begin with, "Oh, I was thinking the other day about the cosmological argument. What do you think about this?" That's not how that conversation is going. That typically what's going to happen is someone's going to call you and say, "Wow, I've had a rough year. I think I'm probably heading toward a divorce, or my kids are doing this or that, or I lost a loved one. I lost my parents, and now these are real life issues." And it turns out that that is the context when most of our conversations, even conversations that ultimately might lead to the evidence for Christianity, they're probably starting at a point of pain or a point of struggle or a point of just life meeting, the rubber meeting the road. And that's what this is, the kind of book this is. This is a book that talks about how if you want to flourish as a human, well, I've got 15 things I learned working homicides. Now, they happen to be supported by the studies, the secular studies. So I've included all of those. But they also are ancient principles that are on the pages of the New Testament. And if you simply lived as though Christianity were true, it turns out that you would embrace 15 principles for a living that would change your life for the better immediately. They're not easy principles. It turns out that to live a life that in which you can flourish as designed, you're going to have to bend your knee to the suggestions of the designer. And but if you can do it, you will see that and some of them are quite surprising. I do think people will look at this book and read a few chapters here and go, "Oh, yeah, I didn't see that one." And I saw it only because I was working murders, but you can certainly see it all over the pages of the New Testament. And I've always been hesitant to use the scriptures that way. In other words, are we Christians because it works for us? I used to always say I'm not a Christian because it works for me. To be honest, I was embracing these principles before I ever became a Christian. I had no idea they were grounded in a Christian worldview. I think that Richard Dawkins is just starting to figure this out, did an interview in the last month where he's talking about how he considers himself a cultural Christian. He's not even close to being a Christian, but what he's saying is, I would rather live in a culture created by Christians that reflects a Judeo-Christian worldview. Well, I was kind of living that way and not even realizing that it was a so it was not a I didn't feel like I had this train wreck aspect of my life that I was trying to fix, and maybe I'll come to Jesus to fix it. That was not why I became a Christian. I just determined it was true. But it turns out if it is true, it ought to describe us the way we really are. So
Yeah, and as they say, I mean, they rightly say all truth is God's truth, and you're discovering these, you're evaluating these, and sharing these from truths that you learn from the crime scene investigating, things that are backed by secular studies, and they're true because that's how God has designed
that's right.
things to work well, and so for humans to flourish, and so it's not surprising that you can learn them other ways, and it's certainly not surprising that we find those, as you say, rooted in Scripture. So,
Clay, the other thing too is interesting about that. Yeah, you're right. And these are the kinds of things that people will sometimes say, well, that's just it works at least for a season it worked because the culture embraced it. These are if they are workable principles, they're only workable because and we can change the culture. So we can move away from a traditional view, for example, of family. Family could be any kind of construction that we want to because it's only working in this setting because we're in this stuck in this cultural moment. But the truth of it is, and the studies show this, that it's not based on our cultural historical moment. It's based in our biology. In other words, it's based in the nature in which we were created by the creator, not the moment in which we were created. It's based in just our innate biology, which you can trace back to the master biologist, right? So I think this is why I think that this advice is ancient and it won't change. Now we can move away from it from a season, but we will do so at our own peril, and then we'll eventually pendulum back, swing back toward it because it's unsustainable when we move away from God's design for our
yeah.
lives.
And I was just going to comment that very thing. I think we're due and maybe poised at one of those pendulum swings. I think the last decade or so, there's been a lot of areas of culture where they've been kind of running free from what they see as the constraints of previous generations. And I think there's been enough evidence at this point for people to determine that's not working so well. So
Right.
we'll see how that pendulum swings back, and no doubt this book can be a help of pointing people why these things work the way they do and why they help someone to flourish in life. Why do you think it is that your role as a crime scene investigator, a cold
Mhm.
case detective, why is it that that made it possible to pick up on these lessons a little bit more acutely? Is it just because of just kind of the human drama and the passion and the
Yeah.
emotions of everything kind of forced into one small moment of time?
Well, how I've been describing it is that it's the kind of moment you're in when this kind of crime occurs. So if you didn't know what was in my mug, the surest way to find out is just simply to bump it, nudge it, and whatever spills out, you'll finally know. Well, that's what was in there, and you might not have been able to see it. It might have been carefully cloaked by the dark mug. You can't tell that there's something like that in there, but you knock it and you realize, oh, it's coffee. Well, the same kind of thing happens, I think, to us as people. We are pretty good at putting up a veneer that doesn't really expose who we really are, and it's in those moments when you get bumped, when you get nudged by the traumas of life, the pressures of life, the stress. Like on a simple level, how many times have you had a great day with your family, and then there's just some insertion of a minor stress. I don't know. It could be, the car stops working, or it could be something, and suddenly everyone's bickering. It's because someone's bumping your cup, and you're getting a chance to see what is really in there. And I think what happens in these cases is these are kind of these kinds of cases where the people who are involved have reached breaking points. And these breaking points reveal, I think that strips away our ability to keep up a game face. And now we start to see who we really are. And one of the, when you realize that's what's happening, the first thing you have to be honest about is that, but for the grace of God, you haven't been bumped in that way. And it's a field leveler, because I don't really think. Look, we'd like to think that the world is divided between good people and bad people, when it's really just divided between humble people and proud people, to be honest. And are we willing to submit to something that's so otherly because it's divine? That and I think that's the thing we typically don't want to give up. There's a chapter in this book which is about celebrity, and I got focused on this really back when I was working a case involving a local street legend in our city. He was a gangster who was so uniquely tattooed that, it was kinda hard to mi and I didn't describe some of the vulgarity of the tattoos in the book, but one was so obvious that the victim could easily say, "Well, yeah, he had this written across his forehead." And I'm like, "Okay, well, how many guys are gonna have that?" So, we figured out who he was, and we go out to interview him. Well, he was kind of untouchable. We never did make a case against him. He was very slippery, and you would think, well, that should be a slam dunk, right? Well, it wasn't, and we ended up he never went to jail for that case. But he ended up dying on the streets, not because of anything because of his celebrity. It turned out that the celebrity was the cause of his eventual downfall, how he saw himself. Well, it turns out this is really true for all of us. And the only cure for celebrity is an attribute of human flourishing that I think is surprising for most people, especially secular people. If you said to a secular person, there's one thing you can embrace right now that would change your life for the better in almost every measurable category of human flourishing, every single measurable category, whether it's depth of relationships, income you're going to earn, grades you're going to get, how long you're going to live, how healthy and fit and mentally stable you'll be. And it's this attribute that secular research calls humility. Well, it turns out that's just the opposite of celebrity. Is that when you have a proper assessment of who you are, and so that principle, by the way, it's uniquely leveraged by a Christian worldview. Uniquely, there is no other theistic system that promotes humility as well as Christianity. Period. There is no other secular system that promotes, and it happens to be the one thing that would help us to flourish most if we simply embraced it. The one thing is humility. That's weird, right? And it turns out that if you're in a system in which you are earning something, whether that's a secular system, a meritocracy where you earn your income, you earn your status, you earn, or you're in a theistic system where you earn the right to stand before God, or you earn the right to, whatever the system is offering its highest offer, you have to do these 5, 4, 6, 8, 10 things to do it. Those are all systems that amplify pride because at some point it's transactional. I did this, therefore you need to do this for me. And that transactional approach to life just feeds pride. It feeds self-focus and instead of humility. You'd have to develop a system in which you said, you know what? No, it's not what you can earn. You couldn't even if you tried to earn, you just mess it up. I'll tell you what we're going to do. You're so pathetic. I'm just going to give it to you so that no one can boast. Well, that's the free gift called salvation that's offered under Christianity, the one worldview that says it's not about doing something, it's about what's been done for you. Well, that actually, in order to even start in that system, you have to bend your knee. There is a God and you're not him. And you have to accept the fact that you're not going to do this better than the other brother in Christ. Okay. Because it's not about what you're doing. Well, that actually would grow the one aspect of life, human life, that would cause you to flourish the most, humility. And so I think that's not a coincidence that this worldview we happen to be sitting in called Christianity happens to leverage the one best tool so humans can flourish. It's because it's from that mind of the designer, and he knows what's best for us, and that's why the way up has always been down. That's why those who submit will always lead. Those who think they are leaders will always find themselves in last. The first will be last. The last will be first. It's an upside down, humility driven worldview that it just so happens that the recent scholarship on this, the studies of this demonstrate, the research demonstrates that, yeah, this actually is in the best interest of humans. In other words, even if you didn't think Christianity was true, you'd be smart to live as though it is.
Yeah, I think it's is it Peter Jones that has only two religions is his kind of framework, and you've got Christianity, which is free grace, free gift of grace through Jesus, and everything else. It doesn't matter
That's right.
if you are secular, if you are Buddhist, if you are Muslim. It is essentially a works based system, a merit
Yes,
based system to
that's right.
whatever end that worldview pushes, and the gospel is uniquely a pride killer. I mean, we look at
Yeah,
uh, our complete and utter dependence on Christ. And as you alluded to in Romans, we can't boast in any of these things. Who
that's
can
right.
boast in the gifts that we've been given. So humility definitely features in the book as really one of the key lessons that you have. And you've touched on how it impacts us in life. It's not just a theological element that, oh, be humble regarding salvation.
Yeah,
No, that's a filter into every other area
that's right.
of your life. Everything you have is a gift from God, and you've got no reason to boast in any area. What are some of the other lessons that you touch on in this book? You don't have to, rattle off all
Yeah, no, no,
15,
no,
but
no
what are some
problem.
others people should know about?
Well, okay, so there's a couple here that I thought were interesting that I never had really thought about much until I started working these cases. One was a case in which a woman had 2 sons, and she called me after the second one was arrested for murder, and the first one had died at a party, and I call it A Tale of Two Brothers in the book. And what's interesting about it is that it was her struggle personally as a single mom raising 2 boys, between the 2 polar inclinations we have that are ingrained in our hearts of justice and mercy. And why do we have these two? And the studies show how justice impacts us biologically as humans and why we are interested in justice and how early as humans we are interested in justice as we're growing up. I mean, children very immediately understand, have a sense of justice, and also how we are impacted by mercy. These 2 things are part of our nature because they are in the nature of God. As a matter of fact, I show in the book, there's a lot of places where you'll see in the Old Testament that God is described as the fullness of justice and mercy, or the fullness of truth and grace, or this is where justice and mercy kiss in the Psalms. You'll see it throughout. I'm in Job right now. There are so many places in Job where God's nature is described as both just and merciful. And you'll see this over and over and over again. Then John, when Jesus arrives in John chapter 1, describes Jesus as the arriving in the fullness of truth and grace. And that's not to say that he was true and he was gracious. It's to say that only one being holds truth and grace in fullness. That is God. To say that Jesus arrives in the fullness of truth and grace, you're basically evoking the Old Testament passages and you're saying this is God. This is a claim to deity in John 1. Now, none of us do this well. We are either too loving and we let all kinds of craziness in the church and we don't even call it out for what it is, or we're too judgmental and we don't even treat people with kindness. We're always out of balance. And every letter, if you think about it, is a command to either raise one side or the other. Like you're either not full on one side or not full on the other. So you see this throughout scripture. But it turns out that the secular studies also show that every program in which leadership is a key, including parenting, coaching, reform and rehabilitation programs, anywhere you're leading anywhere, holding those 2 things in balance is the key to success. Now, I was recently at a school and where I had a bunch of teachers, Christian school, and I simply got a whiteboard out and I say, "Hey, if we want to love like God loves, because it says in scripture, God is love, what would that look like? Can you give me some words that capture the essence of love?" And they gave me like 30 or 40 words that were synonyms for love. Well, then I shared with them what the scriptures say about God is love, but God is also the fullness of grace and truth. So you could take out the middle part of the equation. That means that love is the fullness of grace and truth. To love like God loves means you have to love in the fullness of grace and truth. And as I looked at the whiteboard, there wasn't a single word on that board. I mean, there were words like adoration, affection, caring, acceptance, tolerance. These are the words that were given me by Christian teachers and high school teachers. And not a single word on that wall encapsulated anything that has to do with justice or truth. So I think what we've mistakenly we've bought the world's view of love, which is just adoration, affection, caring, but don't no truth telling. Truth telling is not part of the love project according to the world, but it certainly is part of the love project according to God. And it turns out we do best, we raise our kids best if we encapsulate both sides of that scale. The truth justice the truth justice on one side, love and mercy on the other side. So we really have to be able to master that, and if you will simply master that, you will do a lot better. What this one particular lady who called me about was she had been really strict with her first son and he had rebelled, and it didn't produce the results that she was hoping for. And with her second son, she had been way to just put up with anything, and he kind of ran all over her. So the reality of it is, it's when we balance, then we call this tough love because that incorporates tough represents the truth and justice side. Love represents the grace and mercy side. So tough love is just that expression of how we might try to love more like God. because God does love us in that way enough, well enough to be able to tell us when we're being idiots. Okay, so the truth telling side is important to that equation. So that's just something that I think as you work these cases, you almost always encounter somebody who was raised out of balance, or who is was pampered out of balance, and or treated too harshly out of balance. One of those two, and then he ends up not turning out quite the way his parents had hoped.
And of course, you can extrapolate that from one home and the pain and the tragedy of that home to a culture of that love is it's no longer loving as soon as you tell me a truth that I'm not interested in,
Yes,
you
that's
know,
right.
and we
That's
see
right.
that and the effects of that in our culture of pretending as if the only way to be loving is to endorse anything that I wanna do. Well,
That's right.
sometimes loving is coming alongside and saying, "This is destructive, it's not honoring to God, it's not helpful to you, it's wrong."
Yes.
That can be loving as well, but we've kinda concocted our own version of love, in which doesn't include that.
No, you're right, and I think this is probably the key to the book for me, is this is a book that tries to tell you the truth about, but it also tries to make a case that this hard truth, and some of these chapters are hard truths. As I was putting the book together and creating video for the book, I could see that even within the church, there are some things that we like. The most controversial chapters in this book, I think, will probably be the chapter on marriage and the chapter on fatherhood, because I think we have, as a culture, abandoned the necessity for any of these traditional structures, because we think that, hey, anything we can concoct in which people they care for each other, they love each other, that is sufficient to lead to the kind of human flourishing that we have seen for generations. If you did it the other way, the traditional way, but it turns out that all of the data does not support that. And we have to be honest. If I'm saying to you that you would be wise, if flourishing was your goal, that you would be wise to marry, because the statistics reveal that. That's not single shaming. That's not me saying, but no, it's actually, it's not my data. It's the data we see in studies. If you look at the fatherlessness issue, for example, we have right now in our country the growing number of household units in which there's not a biological father present, you would be alarmed. And it's
Yeah.
not a coincidence. If you've ever worked gangs, this is the story in this book. Is the chapter is a gangster that got pretty involved with as a mentor. That kid, like everybody else I worked when I was working gangs, suffer from the same. Let's put it this way: in my city, we had four utterly different groups, cliques of gangsters. They were different from an ethnic perspective, from racial perspective, economic perspective. They didn't have a lot of similarities: white, black, Korean, Hispanic, and different parts of town, different income levels. And I'm trying to figure out, at the time I was a young dad, and I was trying to figure out, like, what is the common denominator with all these kids who are viciously killing each other? And the common denominator was lack of dad. And it
Yeah.
looked different depending on the group. For some, they never knew their dad. For some, their dad was always in custody. For some, their dad was never available, always drunk, just a kind of a just uninvolved father. For some, their fathers were really upstanding citizens and were on the boards of certain like city level groups, and they were workaholics. They were never they would be working 80 hours a week. And so I thought, well, wow, well, hang on, that's striking to me that and some of these gangsters were quite wealthy, driving Acuras when they're doing drive-bys. And you're
Wow.
thinking to yourself, wow, this is weird, right? All had lack of dad, though. This was the different form of lack of dad, depending on the group, depending on the household. And that was sobering for me, because it made me realize, as I was working so much overtime working gangs, I was never home. And I thought, wow, this is a wake up call. It wouldn't matter. I'll produce the same kind of kid if I'm not careful here, because I'm not home. I'm not engaged with my kids any more than these dads were engaged with theirs. So it was a wake up call for me. And I think we have to get comfortable with speaking that truth. So here's a book that I hope is loving, but I hope it speaks truth, because it's those two things together. And what I've discovered is that most people are take things very personally. So if they are single, well, then they hate that chapter on marriage. If they're divorced, well, they hate that chapter on fatherhood. If they are somebody who they had got a kid maybe who went sideways because they were either too harsh or too lenient, then they hate that book on balance, that chapter on balance. So we take these things personally. Now, there's another chapter in this book about friendships that I think will kind of unlocks it. And well, I know your time is precious, but I'll just tell you that that this chapter on I wrote a chapter on friendship only because so many people that you investigate are killed by their friends, people they called a friend. So I have a story of a woman who was killed by somebody she thought was her best friend. So what does it mean to have a good friend? What are good friends even look? What's the definition here? And there's been a study done, a longitudinal study of 60 years that talked about human satisfaction, life happiness, and friendships were at the top of the list. But it's not just, I want to know what kind of friendship, because clearly this woman had friends and she's dead. So what kind of friends are we talking about? So here's what it turns out. It turns out that the kinds of friends that lead to human flourishing are when you have now three things. That's the first thing, a small group of deeply connected, deep diving friends who know you intimately. Those first two things may not sound like much, but they're critical because you can't be that close to more than a small number of people. So if you think that everyone on your social media platform is actually a good friend, that's not true. There are some people that you're so close to that you'll let them do the truth side of the love equation. You'll let them speak truth to you. Because a lot of times we're saying, well, yeah, if I speak truth to my friend, they'll just walk away from me. Well, that's not the kind of deep diving friend then. You're not in that deep diving circle. Because a deep dive friend is somebody who it's like you love this person so much that you're not going to lose them as a friend, even when they speak hard truth to you. You're not going to push them away. They're like family to you. So you need to have a group that's small that are that well connected to you that they can speak truth to you. And then the third thing you have to have is this thing that's harder to lock down, and it's virtue. Because this woman who died, she did have a small number of people that she could be honest with, but one of them killed her because the virtue side was missing. Now, what's interesting about adding virtue to any equation is then the question becomes, well, yeah, but who decides what's virtuous? Because I've worked, in communities where virtue is very different. What's right, what's wrong, what you can expect in life, like what's good, what's bad. Those are very, there's a code amongst thieves. And so if a group gets to decide what's virtuous, well, then I can justify all kinds of behavior. So it turns out if you want to have the kinds of the kinds of friends rather that help you flourish, you're going to have to lock in virtue in something objective, something that is transcendent. So it turns out if you did hold a theistic worldview in which righteousness, virtue, good, morality is not a matter of opinion, your opinion versus somebody else, but is actually an objective reality that comes from the mind of God, well, now you've got a better chance of surrounding yourself with people who won't ultimately end up on a defendant's table. So, it's important for us to think about like how, and then in every chapter of this book, what I try to do is to give you, it's called chase the lead in the book, each chapter. Okay, so if that's what you're looking for, what do those kinds of friends look like? Like if you had to make a list right now of the attributes of the friends you have, do they possess any of these attributes? And so I have a list in the book in each chapter of the things you can do to make that principle real in your life. Because I think in the end, this is what this book is, right? It's more pastoral. It's how, if Christianity is true, how might it explain your experience better, and how could you surrender to it in such a way that you would flourish?
And even just hearing you go over those different things, whether it's kind of the cautionary side of things or the chapters that bother people because it touches on things that maybe they feel inadequate at, or even developing close, personal, intimate relationships, you can see why humility is
Yeah,
such a key element of this because you won't hear from someone either a printed page or a personal conversation if you allow your pride to stop your ears and you're not humble enough to learn something. Just all those elements, they really do seem dependent on our ability to remain humble, remain open to hearing things
that's right.
and being told in a loving way, hopefully, but being told we're wrong when we're wrong.
Well, and
And
that's
these
why
other lessons that you have here too.
yeah, and that's why sometimes these lessons in this book, for me, it was a bit of a personal, cathartic, personal process because I suck at all of these. I mean, these 15 things, I don't do these well. I struggle with all of them, and
Yeah.
but if I don't remind myself that there is a target I'm aiming at, then I'm not going to hit anything ever.
Yep.
So it's not as though I've mastered these. Certainly not the humility thing. I don't know that any of us, and this is a daily struggle. I think Spurgeon said it best. It's like you cannot pursue humility. You just can't. Um, and Spurgeon calls it just the proper assessment of who you are. So humility is not a pursuit that you are involved in. It's a realization that you have to remind yourself of every day. And but even then, I mean, there's often times when the thing that's going to make you angry is that someone kind of bumped up against your pride in a particular area,
Yep.
something that you take great pride in. They basically said it wasn't worth much, and it could just
Yep.
be that they didn't listen to your advice. Any silly thing. The last time you're in a car with a friend who tells you you missed a turn, does that irritate you that you missed that turn? What is that about? That's because it's every day
Yeah.
trying to aim at humility is and reminding. I think one of the best passages on this is in that passage where Simon invites Jesus over for dinner, and a woman from the city comes in and is lavishing Jesus with ointment. And the Simon, a Pharisee, says, "Hey, thinking to himself, if this guy knew who this woman was, he would never let her touch him." And knowing his thoughts, Jesus said, "I'm going to tell you a story, Simon. Two people owed some money to a lender, and one owed a lot of money and one didn't owe that much. And the lender forgave both debts. Who do you think was most pleased to have the debt forgiven?" And Simon says, "Yeah, the guy who owed the most, of course." Well, what Jesus is trying to say there is that Simon is unforgiving because Simon doesn't think he has anything to be forgiven for. And the most unforgiving people you will meet are people who think they have nothing to be forgiven for. Whereas the woman comes in and knows everything that she needs to be forgiven for.
Yep.
So she immediately can be humble. She had a proper assessment of who she was, and that
Yep.
led to her humility. Simon doesn't have a proper assessment of who he is, and therefore he's not humble.
Yep.
So it is up to us on a daily basis to kind of think about, okay, so who am I really? And it's okay. It's okay
Yeah.
if I'm a train wreck because it turns out there's a savior who's going to embrace me, even if I am, or because I am.
Yeah, and you can just see why the gospel is so central because humility isn't just beating up on yourself and turning it into an Eeyore and nothing's ever right and I can't. That's not healthy either.
Right.
It's a proper assessment through the lens of the scriptures, understanding who you are before God,
That's right.
and rightly assessing and keeping your pride in check in any number of areas. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So who do
absolutely.
you see getting the most out
Mm.
of truth in true crime? Obviously, it's clearly applicable to just about anybody. But as you're putting this book together, do you have anyone in mind in terms of who you think would benefit the most from it?
Well, sometimes when you write a case maker, if you're a case maker, you're often building the case in a certain way, in a certain order, because the jury, you want them to see the case, and then it comes to this climactic resolution, like based on all of this, and there's a certain sequence you go in. That's not what this book is. I could have written these chapters in any particular order. I'm not building towards something so much. I just wanted to make sure that everything that I've learned, it was somewhere represented. I probably had 40 topics, but they were in about these 15 categories probably anyway. So I just wanted to get these 15 things. I think there's stuff here that I know I would have done better if I would have been a Christian earlier or had seen the value in these things earlier. But this is the nature of wisdom, right? There's a chapter on wisdom in this book that just talks about how a lot of it is just failure that's leveraged for improvement. And so the part of it is I couldn't probably write this book earlier than I wrote it, but I wish I would have known this stuff and thought more deeply about it earlier. So I'm trying to pitch some very simple biblical principles through true crime so that if you're somebody who would never open up a book about discipleship or a book about what it is to surrender your life to the gospel, um, that you would be willing to entertain this. So I think it's the kind of thing that I see, like I think almost everything I write, I'm thinking about high schoolers because I think this is the kind of stuff I wish I didn't know when I was in high school.
Yeah.
There's this chapter on marriage. It talks about why it should be a priority and what are you looking for? Well, I wish I'd have known I just
Yeah.
dumbed into what I think is it's the best thing in my life. I think it's the best marriage on planet Earth, but I wasn't being thoughtful about it. I just dumbed into it. I think you can be thoughtful about these things, and I wish I would have been thoughtful about these things, and that's why I think now you kind of go back and say, and a lot of this stuff, honestly, Clay, it comes out of my work with Summit Ministries, where we have this 2 week immersion. I was just there yesterday. I flew in this morning, so I just you have high schoolers, and you're trying to help them make these decisions, and they asked me as one of the things like, "What was the one thing you wish you could have done earlier?" Well, I wish I would have got married earlier. I dated my wife for 9 years before I married her. We were 18 years together before we became Christians. I wish we would have become Christians earlier. I wish I would have married her earlier. I wish I would have had more kids, and I would have had them earlier. These are things looking back, if I could do things differently, I would have. So now the question is, this kind of book, I hope, will help somebody else think, yeah, I can see the value in that. Maybe I should entertain that idea earlier.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I think people get a lot out of it and can see the lessons, as we mentioned, can apply to anybody, any walk of life. But I do agree that someone that's thinking about things deeply enough to take these things seriously, to have these questions, and yet have so much life ahead of them that they can really benefit from these things, is an excellent place to start. So, where can folks go to learn more about you and your work and pick up a copy of the book?
I'm writing 3 times a week or posting something 3 times a week at coldcasechristianity.com. But for this book, I always am uncomfortable. We post stuff for free, and we've been posting that for about 15 years. When I write a book, of course, you purchase a book from a bookseller, and I'm always uncomfortable with that. So what I try to do is create a bunch of additional resources that I can offer you for free if you purchase the book. You'll see at thetruthandtruecrime.com that this book comes with it comes with a 30 session, 10 and a half hour case makers course that we offer for free for anyone who buys this book. The PowerPoint, the Bible inserts, everything that goes along with the book is available there. So it's at thetruthandtruecrime.com. And I just found out yesterday that the video sessions, the 16 video sessions and the participants guide for that video curriculum is now available both on Amazon at Zondervan and at Right Now Media. So if you wanted to just watch to kind of get a better idea, it's always an abbreviated version, of course, but it's my best effort to try to get the principles in this book into video form, and that's available online also.
Excellent. Well, I'll be sure to link to all that in the show notes. I'll link to our previous conversations. I'll link to the truthandtruecrime.com where people can go get those extra resources, pick up a copy of the book. So, our conversation has been with J. Warner Wallace. The book is The Truth in True Crime: How Investigating Death Teaches Us the Meaning of Life. Thanks so much for joining me once again on the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm indebted to you.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and, more importantly, sharing this video with a friend who you think would get something out of it. You can find additional resources at reasonabletheology.org.